So we're going to look at this idea that's called the Hardy-Weinberg theorem, or the Hardy-Weinberg. Well, we'll look at this whole idea. Hardy-Weinberg is kind of the general term. Obviously, it's created or was described first by two men, one with the last name Hardy and one with the last name Weinberg. So that's kind of the deal. So first, we're going to get some background information. So we have to remember what a population is, which is just a group of individuals belonging to the same species. So we have to all belong to the same species for this to exist. And remember, populations evolve, not individuals. One thing we have to define is what is a species. So if you kind of remember from freshman bio, a species is a group of populations whose individuals have the potential to interbreed. So, and, you know, of course, they have to be able to interbreed. So like a mule, for example, can't be a species because it cannot breed with itself to produce other mules, which we'll get into later. Don't worry if you don't remember that example. Okay. So one of the things that we kind of talk about with the Hardy-Weinberg theorem, or just this whole principle, is this idea of a gene pool. So a gene pool is the total genes, all the genes, so all of, if we're looking at a population like of you guys, of the AP Bio students, it would be every single person's genes in a population at any one time. Okay, so that's what the gene pool is. And so let's look, we're going to look kind of an example of how you can calculate, there's some numbers that are associated. So a flower population. Okay, and we're going to have, our population is going to have 50, so our population, I abbreviated, 500 individuals. I said 50, but I meant 500. Okay, 20 of them are going to be white. 320 of them are going to be homozygous for the pink gene, meaning they have both pink alleles, right? They got one from their mom and one from their dad, and yes, flowers have moms and dads, or there's males and females. So they got one, and they got both of the pink genes, and 160 of them are going to be heterozygous for the pink gene. That means they have one pink gene and they have one white gene, but they're going to show what we see, what their phenotype is pink, okay? So if you want to calculate the allele frequency when your population, when you're given numbers like this, you can calculate it, because if you remember, like these guys are little a, okay? These ones are big A, and these ones are big A, little a. Okay, so if we want to calculate the allele frequency for little a, I'm going to run out of space. Sorry. Each of these individuals has two alleles, right? So we're going to do 2 times 20. Okay, plus these guys have one little a allele, so plus 160 divided by the total, which the total amount of alleles in this population is going to be 2 times the number of individuals, because each individual has 2 alleles. So times or divided by 1,000, which is going to equal 0.2. Okay. Then if we look at the big A, okay, we can do, it's 2 times 320, right? 2 times 320, because each of those has 2 big A alleles, plus 160 divided by 1,000. Okay, and if we divide all this out, we're going to get 0.8. Okay, and if you notice these add up to 1, that will come important later when we're doing some Hardy-Weinberg actual calculations. Okay, so let's talk about what this whole Hardy-Weinberg theorem is. What's the whole deal with this guy? Now I'm going to write it out and then we'll talk about it. Okay, it's kind of a funny theorem. It's the frequency of alleles, like we just calculated, and genotypes in a population's gene pool, so we know what that is, remain constant over generations. This is supposed to be an over. Unless Okay, so basically what we're saying is this is gonna stay the same over, hundreds of generations. These flowers will keep breeding and will keep making more and more and more. But if we ever took a sample of 500 individuals, we'd have these same frequencies and numbers, unless acted upon by agents, and we'll talk about what those agents are in a second, other than just normal sexual recombination. All right, normal sexual recombination, normal sex stuff that normally happens, okay? Now, these agents always happen. So the Hardy-Weinberg theorem actually never exists in nature, and we'll see why, because there's always some agent that's actually acting upon a population. So one of the other things we're going to talk about before we get to those agents is this idea of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So a population will actually never be, or very rarely will it be, at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, because the allele frequency is constant. That's what we say when a population is at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We're saying that the allele frequency is constant from generation to generation. So for the allele frequency that we just talked about with the flowers, it would always be 0.2 would be have the white allele, and 0.8 would be the pink allele. It would stay the same in 5 generations, in 50 generations, in 500 generations. It would always stay the same. And that's because, and the reason why this never exists is because we have to meet these 5 required conditions, or these are the 5 agents that we kind of described on the first page. So, are you ready for the 5 agents? So the first one is you must have a large population. Okay, so that's why the bottleneck and the founder's effect can change drastically, because you don't have a large population. You must be isolated from other populations. Okay, or another way to say this is no genetic drift. You can't have things, or gene flow. You can't have genes coming in, and you can't have genes leaving. That's pretty hard to do. Not impossible though, islands and stuff. You can have no mutations. Well, that's pretty much impossible. How do you prevent the DNA from mutating? You have to have random mating or no sexual selection, okay? And we've seen a lot of organisms that exhibit this sexual selection, so you'd have to have random mating. And you have to have no natural selection. So you have to have no trait, it might, picking on the flowers from the previous page, what if it's more advantageous to be a pink flower than it is to be a white flower? That can't exist if you want your population to be at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay, so you can kind of see how this would never, ever really, truly happen. Now, the last thing we're going to do, and we're going to practice with this calculation, so kind of just start to understand it. We're going to practice with it in class. Is there's some equations that are associated with this. So the first equation, and these are on your equation sheets that you get, is P plus Q equals 1. Wow, super hard. So P equals the frequency of the dominant allele. So that was that 0.8 that we saw on the other side. And Q equals the frequency, I'm just going to kind of start to abbreviate frequency, of the recessive allele. And remember, recessive is the one usually written in the little a, and it's, okay. And then if you square all of those and we turn it into a quadratic type equation. So this should look familiar from math, okay? So we now have P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1, okay? So let's kind of write out what all of these mean. So P squared is the frequency, I'm getting lazy, of the homozygous dominant genotype. Or another way to write that is the big A, okay? So it's the frequency of that. 2PQ, so add those all together. So if you took 2 times this P times this Q, you would get this number, or there's other ways to kind of calculate it. We'll see those when we kind of play with the calculations. Is the frequency of the heterozygous genotype, or big A, little a, okay? And then finally, we have Q squared, which is the frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype. Or little a. Okay, so we'll look at how all of these relate and how we can, if we know one of them, we can calculate all of them. And you can probably already start to see. If you know q squared, you can square root it and get q, and then you can subtract that from 1 and get p, and then you can square that and get p squared, and then you multiply those two numbers and get... So, and we'll manipulate these, and we're going to practice on we're going to spend 2 days in class manipulating this and practicing. So do not stress if this is like, starting to kind of be a little nervous. There's lots of practice that we'll have. So make sure you bring your calculators, and that's it.